What if I told you the grandest home in America was never built for the living dream, but for a dying fortune? Behind its golden halls and glittering chandeliers lies a secret buried in debt, desperation, and sacrifice. A paradise that nearly destroyed the man who created it. So how did America's largest mansion become its most haunting mystery? Stay with me. The truth behind Biltmore's beauty is darker than you've ever imagined. In the waning years of the 19th century, as the smoke of industry curled above America's cities and fortunes rose faster than the steel rails that stitched the continent together, a young man named George Washington Vanderbilt II stood at the threshold of a dream. He was the youngest son of William Henry Vanderbilt, heir to the colossal railroad empire that had reshaped the American landscape. Yet unlike his brothers, whose hearts were tethered to commerce and expansion, George was a scholar, a collector, a man of quiet vision who longed for something beyond the clang of industry and the endless pursuit of profit. Where others sought to build empires of steel, he sought to build a sanctuary for the soul. He was barely in his 20s when the idea first took root. A trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina in 1888 changed everything. There, amid rolling mist and forests older than memory, George found what he called the most beautiful country in the world. The air was crisp, unspoiled, and alive with silence. To him, it was a place where art, nature, and human creation could exist in perfect harmony. He saw not wilderness, but potential, a living canvas upon which he could paint. His grandest vision, a home that would embody beauty, intellect, and progress. From that moment, the dream began to crystallize into something immense, something almost divine in its scope. He purchased 125,000 acres of land, a territory so vast it seemed to swallow the horizon. What he envisioned was not merely a house, but an estate that would stand as a new kind of American ideal, a self-sustaining world, where architecture, art, and agriculture would coexist as one. He called upon the most brilliant minds of his time, the renowned architect Richard Morris Hunt, who had designed palaces for the American elite, was chosen to craft the mansion itself, a French Renaissance chateau rising from the southern soil. For the grounds, George turned to Frederick Law Olmsted, the visionary landscape architect who had designed Central Park. Together, they would create a masterpiece that blurred the line between civilization and wilderness. Construction began in 1889, and what followed was one of the most ambitious building projects in American history. Each stone that formed the mansion's walls was quarried from the very mountains that surrounded it. The railway was extended just to carry in materials and supplies. Over 1,000 men worked tirelessly, 6 days a week, in a relentless rhythm of hammering, hauling, and carving. Masons, carpenters, stonecutters, and blacksmiths labored through the seasons, their sweat staining the earth. Many were immigrants, men who had come from distant shores, seeking opportunity, now toiling in the shadow of a dream they could scarcely comprehend. The mansion that rose before them was not a house, but a kingdom, with 250 rooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, and a banquet hall large enough to host the echoes of an orchestra. It defied reason and redefined scale. The architecture borrowed its soul from the French Loire Valley, but its heart was deeply American, a statement of what wealth and imagination could build on this young nation's soil. Within its walls would hang paintings by Renoir and Whistler, rare tapestries from Europe, and shelves that would cradle over 20,000 volumes of literature. George filled his halls not with guests of grandeur alone, but with thinkers, artists, and scientists. The Biltmore was to be a sanctuary for the mind, a haven for study and reflection. But while it was built upon intellect and taste, it was also built upon immense power, the inherited power of the Vanderbilt fortune, born from the relentless march of railroads and the labor of millions. Behind every marble column was the unspoken truth of the Gilded Age, that luxury for a few was paid for by the toil of countless unseen hands. The era was one of contrasts, glittering wealth set against widespread poverty, towers of gold rising from streets lined with struggle. Yet to George, the Biltmore was not excess but expression. He saw in it not vanity, but vision, a place where knowledge and stewardship of the land could thrive, where America could prove that refinement and prosperity might walk hand in hand. The estate itself was more than just the mansion surrounding it. Olmsted envisioned a living landscape that could heal the scarred wilderness left by years of reckless logging. Forests were replanted, rivers redirected, Gardens designed to bloom through every season. What had once been exhausted farmland began to breathe again. The Biltmore became one of the earliest examples of scientific forestry in the United States, an experiment in sustainability decades before the word existed in common speech. George invited experts to study and cultivate the land, turning the estate into a laboratory of nature and progress. Each decision was meticulous, almost obsessive. Every stone, every pane of glass, every imported tree spoke of George's unrelenting pursuit of perfection. He was not building merely for comfort, but for eternity. The workers, meanwhile, lived in temporary villages erected on the estate, raising families under the constant hum of construction. They sang to keep rhythm, laughed to defy exhaustion, and dreamed of what life might hold when the work was finally done. For 6 long years, the mountain rang with the sounds of their creation, the clang of hammers, the crack of timber, the whistle of trains bringing in materials from afar. By Christmas Eve of 1895, the dream stood complete. The Biltmore house opened its doors for the first time, its grand staircase winding upward like a marble river, its chandeliers glowing with the light of innovation, electricity, a luxury rare even among the wealthy. Guests entered in awe, their footsteps swallowed by the immensity of the space. George stood among them, not as a conqueror of industry, but as a curator of wonder. He had built something no American had ever dared to imagine, a European-style palace in the heart of the Appalachian wilderness, a triumph of human will over the raw power of nature. Outside, the winter wind howled through the mountains, a reminder that the wilderness still waited just beyond the estate's manicured borders. Inside, the halls were alive with laughter, music, and the flicker of firelight. Yet, even then, beneath the surface of celebration, the foundations of fragility had already begun to take root. The cost of the estate, nearly 6 years of relentless spending, had stretched even the Vanderbilt fortune thin. But that truth was still hidden beneath layers of beauty, buried beneath the grandeur of the moment. For now, there was only the glow of achievement. A young man's vision had been forged into stone and spirit. The dream of Biltmore had been born, not yet haunted by the shadows that would follow, not yet touched by the weight of history. It stood as a symbol of a nation's boundless ambition, and of one man's belief that beauty itself could be an act of creation. The world would look upon it in awe, never knowing the quiet cost that had already begun to whisper through its walls. The Biltmore stood like a jewel in the Carolina wilderness, radiant and defiant against the passage of time. But as the last echo of hammers faded from its halls, the brilliance of its birth began to darken under the weight of its own creation. What had started as an act of vision and artistry slowly became an empire of expenses, living monument that demanded to be fed. George Washington Vanderbilt, the man who had once stood in awe of his own dream, began to sense the quiet tremors of its cost. The hidden machinery of his fortune, the stocks, the bonds, the railroads, was not infinite. The world beyond the mountains was changing, and even the great Vanderbilt name could not stop the tide that was coming. The Gilded Age had made America glitter. Money flowed like water for the few who stood at its summit, but that river was never steady. By the turn of the century, the nation trembled under economic shocks and shifting tides of power. Factories that had built the Vanderbilt's wealth began to falter. Railroads faced strikes, regulations, and competition. Inflation crept upward, biting into profits. The financial pillars that had seemed indestructible began to creak under the strain of progress. And deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, George was spending at a pace no fortune could sustain. Biltmore was not just a home, it was a living organism. It required constant care, grounds to be maintained, stables to be filled, servants to be paid, machinery to be repaired, and hundreds of acres to be cultivated. The estate consumed money with a quiet, relentless appetite. Every chandelier that sparkled, every fire that burned in the hearth, every horse that galloped across its meadows carried with it a cost. Behind the elegance there was an endless ledger. Thousands of dollars each month flowed into the mansion just to keep it breathing. The estate's books became a battlefield of numbers, each column a reminder that beauty had a price, and that price was climbing higher than anyone had foreseen. George Vanderbilt had never intended for Biltmore to be a mere display of wealth. He envisioned it as a model of self-sufficiency, a place where art and agriculture would sustain each other. But even that ideal required immense investment. He poured funds into experimental farms, forestry research, and model dairies. He hired scientists to study soil, botanists to tend the gardens, and foresters to protect the land. These endeavors were noble, even visionary, but they yielded little profit. The estate was a dream, sustained not by income, but by inheritance. To the outside world, Biltmore remained a wonder, a symbol of boundless luxury and taste. Visitors came to marvel at its grandeur, unaware of the strain tightening like a noose behind its walls. In Asheville, whispers began to spread of the immense sums being spent, of the rail cars of supplies arriving daily, of the growing distance between the estate's splendor and the reality of those who worked its soil. The people of the region, many of whom had labored to build the mansion, now lived in its shadow, their lives unchanged by the wealth that loomed above them. The contrast between the marble halls of Biltmore and the wooden shacks of the mountains became a quiet reflection of the age itself, opulence for the few, endurance for the many. George, though insulated by privilege, was not blind to the storm gathering around him. The panic of 1893 had already shown how fragile fortunes could be. Bank failures swept through the nation. Unemployment soared. Railroads collapsed under debt. And with them, the foundations of the Vanderbilt empire trembled. Though his family's wealth cushioned him from ruin, it was clear that the age of effortless prosperity was fading. The mansion that had once symbolized triumph now carried the faint scent of hubris. Still, George pressed on. Pride, vision, and perhaps denial drove him to keep expanding, refining, perfecting. He brought in new staff, expanded the gardens, and continued to invest in his forestry projects. He began to hope that agriculture would provide a solution, that the land could eventually sustain itself. But the soil of the mountains, though rich in spirit, yielded little profit. The estate's expenses continued to climb while its income remained a whisper against a rising storm. Debt began to creep into the Vanderbilt ledgers, subtle at first, then heavier with each passing year. The family borrowed quietly, discreetly, to maintain the illusion of stability. Letters to bankers and business associates carried the tone of restraint. But behind them was growing urgency. Even with the vast Vanderbilt inheritance, the cost of Biltmore was an open wound that refused to close. By the early 1900s, the nation was changing faster than anyone could have imagined. The old world of dynastic wealth was colliding with a new America, industrial, restless, democratic. The great fortunes of the Gilded Age were beginning to fracture under taxes, inflation, and shifting social winds. To maintain such vast estates was to fight against the current of history itself. The mansion that had once seemed eternal was now a relic of an age already passing. George's own health began to decline under the weight of responsibility. He had built Biltmore as a refuge from the world, but it had become a prison of obligation. Every room that once filled him with pride now whispered of unfinished accounts, unpaid debts, and unrelenting maintenance. The estate staff numbered in the hundreds, and each one relied on him for livelihood. The forests he had planted needed tending, the livestock needed feed, the machines needed oil. The walls themselves seemed to demand constant attention. The house was alive, but its master was slowly fading. By the time the new century arrived, the Vanderbilt fortune was no longer what it had been. The estate's financial drain was unending. Inflation gnawed at the value of investments, while foreign loans once taken to cover construction costs hung heavy over the family's shoulders. The once proud dream of self-sufficiency had turned into a labyrinth of debt. Yet still, the gates remained open to guests of distinction, and the illusion of grandeur persisted. The chandeliers glowed, the fountains flowed, and the great organ filled the halls with music masking the quiet desperation beneath the melody. The burden extended beyond numbers. It reached into the very fabric of the family's life. George's wife, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, began to shoulder more of the estate's management, struggling to keep order amid financial strain. Together, they searched for ways to make Biltmore pay for itself without surrendering its dignity. They opened new industries on the land, from forestry to dairy production, but the scale of expenses dwarfed the income these ventures could generate. Every acre of progress seemed to cost 10 acres more, and as America moved into the age of the automobile and modern convenience, the world George had built began to feel distant. The great mansions of the Gilded Age were falling silent one by one, their families retreating, their fortunes spent. What had once been symbols of progress now stood as monuments to excess. In this shifting landscape, Biltmore's beauty grew only more haunting. Through the towering arches and marble corridors, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Each portrait, each candle, each step on the grand staircase carried the echo of its cost. The house demanded loyalty, demanded sacrifice, demanded that its creator get everything he had to keep its lights burning. And he did. Piece by piece, the fortune that had built it began to dissolve back into the dream that had inspired it. Outside, the mountains stood silent, watching. The same wilderness that had first called George to build his paradise now surrounded it like an ancient reminder, beautiful, eternal, untouched by human grandeur. Inside, beneath ceilings gilded with ambition, the quiet truth settled in. Even the greatest dreams, when built on mortal wealth, begin to devour themselves. When George Washington Vanderbilt II died unexpectedly in 1914, the silence that fell over Biltmore was not just the quiet of mourning, it was the silence of uncertainty. The man who had imagined every stone and every tree of the estate was gone, leaving behind not only the largest private home in America, but also the immense weight of its upkeep. The vision had always been his, the dream his alone. Now it rested on the shoulders of his widow, Edith Stuyvesant Vanderbilt, a woman of grace, courage, who suddenly found herself the guardian of a world too vast for one person to hold. Edith had been born into privilege, yet she was not a woman of idle luxury. She understood duty, and in the days following George's death, duty became her constant companion. The estate he left behind was magnificent, but it was also fragile. Beneath the splendor lay debts, unpaid loans, and mounting costs that dwarfed the income the land could produce. The dream of self-sufficiency that George had cherished was still far from reality. Edith faced a question no Vanderbilt had ever truly asked before: how does one keep an empire alive when the fortune that built it has begun to fade? The world beyond Biltmore's gates was shifting fast. The Great War had erupted in Europe, sending shockwaves through global markets. Inflation tightened its grip, and the financial security that had once seemed unshakable now wavered. The vast Vanderbilt wealth, once a symbol of indestructibility, was suddenly vulnerable. Foreign investments lost value, shipping routes were disrupted, and the flow of goods and profits slowed to a trickle. In the quiet corridors of the mansion, amid the scent of polished wood, fading roses, Edith began the battle to save her husband's creation. She was meticulous, disciplined, and unyielding. Every expenditure was examined, every account recalculated. She sold off unnecessary luxuries, negotiated with creditors, and found ways to reduce the estate's massive payroll without dismantling its essence. The Biltmore Estate had once been sustained by the sheer force of inheritance. Now it had to learn how to earn its own survival. Edith turned her attention to the land itself. The dairy, the farms, the forestry, all of it could be refined, improved, made more efficient. Under her direction, the estate became a working organism again, not just a symbol of grandeur, but a place of production. But it was never enough. The upkeep of such an immense property devoured money faster than any income could replace it. The walls themselves seemed to consume wealth, the repairs, the heating, the maintenance of a mansion with hundreds of rooms and endless corridors. Every year, more of the family's reserves vanished into its depths. Even the forests, once a symbol of renewal, had to be managed with ruthless precision. To preserve them, she had to sell portions of them, tracts of land that had once been George's pride. It was a painful decision, one that cut into the very heart of what the estate represented, but Edith saw what her husband could not, that sometimes, to save something, one must let part of it go. She sold nearly 87,000 acres of forest to the federal government, land that would later form the Pisgah National Forest. It was a decision born of necessity, but also vision. By doing so, she not only reduced the financial strain on the estate, but also ensured that the mountains George had loved would remain protected forever. It was a sacrifice that carried both loss and legacy, a giving away that somehow preserved the dream in another form. Yet the sale barely slowed the tide of expenses. The house, the gardens, the staff all demanded constant attention. Every month brought new bills, new crises, new repairs. Amid the turmoil, Edith's focus never wavered from her daughter Cornelia. The young girl had grown up within the grandeur of Biltmore, but her mother was determined that she would also understand resilience and humility. Edith knew that Cornelia would inherit not just the estate, but the burden that came with it. She raised her to be strong, independent, and aware that privilege carried responsibility. While the rest of the world changed, while women marched for rights, while men went to war, while fortunes rose and fell, Biltmore remained both sanctuary and struggle, a reflection of a past too grand to fade and a future too uncertain to ignore. Through the 1910s and 1920s, Edith fought to keep the estate afloat. She modernized operations, leased lands, and opened small ventures to generate income. She dealt personally with bankers and government officials, often traveling alone to secure agreements that would buy her time. Her quiet determination became the invisible backbone of Biltmore's survival. Yet, even her strength could not erase the reality that the estate was an inheritance built on shifting ground. The world that had given rise to it was gone. The great railroads no longer reigned supreme. America's wealth was redistributing, its priorities changing. What had once been a symbol of triumph now felt like a relic of another century. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, the blow was devastating. Banks failed, markets collapsed, and even the wealthy found themselves cornered by debt. For the Vanderbilts, the timing was cruel. Whatever stability Edith had fought to create was swept away by forces beyond her control. Tourism dried up, farms struggled, and the value of the estate's assets plummeted. The grand halls that had once hosted presidents and aristocrats now echoed with the sound of empty footsteps. To keep the estate alive, Edith and her daughter made a decision that would change Biltmore's fate forever. In 1930, the mansion opened its doors to the public for the first time. It was a radical idea, almost unthinkable for a family of such prestige. The largest private home in America would now be a place for strangers to wander, their admission fees offering a fragile lifeline to its survival. It was a moment of both humility and genius. The people of Asheville, long familiar with the silhouette of the mansion on the horizon, could finally see inside the world that had loomed above them. What they found was not merely luxury, but history, a glimpse into the ambition and beauty that had defined an age. Edith's decision was not just financial, it was deeply human. By opening the doors, she bridged the gap between the estate and the people whose labor had built it. The mansion became not a fortress of privilege, but a living museum of endurance. Every visitor who walked through its halls helped keep it alive, each coin a small act of preservation. Through that act, Edith transformed Biltmore from a dying dream into a story that could continue to be told. Still, the burden never lifted completely. The costs of maintaining such an immense property remained staggering. Even as tourists came and went, the repairs never ceased. The roof needed constant care, the pipes corroded, the gardens demanded ceaseless work. But for the first time, the estate was breathing on its own, sustained by the curiosity of the very people who once looked upon it from afar. Through all of it, Edith remained the quiet steward of her husband's vision. She never allowed despair to overtake her, even when the numbers grew grim and the nights stretched long with worry. To her, the Biltmore was more than a house, it was a promise. A promise to George, to their daughter, to the land itself. It stood as a living memorial to his belief that beauty, intellect, and stewardship could coexist. But unlike the grandeur of its early years, its survival now rested not on inheritance, but on endurance. Each decision she made, each sacrifice she accepted, wove together the fragile thread that kept the estate from falling into ruin. In the quiet evenings, when the lights of the mansion glowed faintly against the mountains, Edith often walked the grounds alone. The forests whispered the memory of George's laughter. The air carried the faint scent of his dream, and though the weight of it all was heavy, she carried it with dignity, holding together what history itself seemed ready to let go. The year rolled on, and time moved gently through the grand halls of Biltmore. What had begun as a private dream had now become a public inheritance, a monument that seemed to exist outside of time itself. Yet beneath the calm beauty of its gardens and the soft glow of its chandeliers lingered the weight of memory, the unseen cost of everything that had come before. By the mid-20th century, Biltmore was no longer the exclusive domain of one of America's wealthiest families. It was something else entirely, a symbol of transformation, of endurance, and of the price that ambition demands. When Cornelia Vanderbilt inherited the estate from her mother, she carried not the thrill of wealth, but the sullen understanding of responsibility. She had watched her mother fight for decades to keep the mansion alive, watched her sell land, open the doors to the public, and sacrifice comfort for preservation. Cornelia had grown up wandering the endless halls of Biltmore, tracing her fingers along the polished banisters, listening to the murmurs of servants and the creaks of ancient floors. To her, the house was both home and burden, filled with ghosts she could not escape. The grandeur that had once seemed eternal was now fragile, dependent on careful management and the curiosity of paying visitors. The estate had survived wars, depressions, and economic shifts, But survival was not the same as peace. Every day brought new challenges: the upkeep of the house, the cost of maintaining the vast grounds, the pressure of preserving history in a world that was racing toward modernity. America itself had changed. The country that had once celebrated the Vanderbilts as symbols of progress now looked upon their world with mixed admiration and unease. The age of opulence was over, a new age of pragmatism had begun, yet Biltmore endured not as a relic but as a living reminder of what once was. The visitors came in steady streams, first by train, then by car. They wandered through the rooms where gilded ceilings still shimmered, where portraits of ancestors gazed down with solemn eyes, where the light through the tall windows painted the floors in gold. Guides told them stories of George Vanderbilt's vision, of the artisans who had carved stone by hand, of the scientists who had studied the forests. But the stories that were not told lingered just beneath the surface. The stories of debt and sacrifice, of the thousands of workers whose names were forgotten, of the countless unseen moments that had built the mansion's soul. The people came seeking beauty, but what they found was something deeper, a haunting sense of time itself, alive in every wall. Outside the mansion, the city of Asheville grew and changed. The mountain air carried the scent of progress and the noise of new life. Roads expanded, buildings rose, and modern America pressed against the edges of Biltmore's gates. Yet inside those gates, the world seemed untouched by change. The estate remained a sanctuary of stillness, a preserved fragment of the Gilded Age. It became a place where history was not just remembered but felt, a physical manifestation of ambition and loss, a mirror held up to the nation's soul. The family continued to manage the estate with quiet resolve. They understood that Biltmore could no longer exist as a private dream. It had to belong to everyone if it was to endure. Over the decades, new generations of Vanderbilts turned their attention toward preservation, business, and tourism. They created vineyards, developed agricultural ventures, and opened more of the estate to visitors. Each adaptation was a delicate balance between profit and protection, between progress and reverence. The house itself became a storyteller, its every room a chapter in a saga that stretched across centuries. The mansion was no longer just the symbol of a single family's power. It had become a reflection of America's complex relationship with wealth and identity. For some, it stood as a beacon of artistic achievement, a testament to what human hands could build when given limitless means. For others, it was a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the grandest dreams can consume those who create them. Its vast rooms, once filled with laughter and orchestras, now held the echoes of footsteps from millions of visitors. Each visitor carried something away with them: admiration, wonder, melancholy. The estate had turned into a living museum of contrasts, the triumph of creation and the shadow of its cost intertwined in every detail. As the decades passed, the world beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains changed with breathtaking speed. Wars came and went. Cities rose and fell. Technology transformed the way people lived and dreamed. But Biltmore remained, rooted in the earth, its stone walls holding back the rush of time. It became part of the American imagination, appearing in photographs, books, and films as the embodiment of a forgotten age. Yet its true story, the struggle, the sacrifice, the quiet endurance of those who kept it alive, remain largely unseen, not only to those who walked its halls in silence long after the crowds had gone. Inside, the house aged gracefully. The air carried the scent of old wood and wax. Dust settled gently on furniture carved by hands long turned to dust themselves. The great library still held its thousands of volumes, silent witnesses to generations of dreams. And through the tall windows, the mountains remained the same, watchful, patient, eternal. They had seen the rise of fortunes and the fall of empires. They had seen George Vanderbilt's dream take shape from their soil, and had watched it endure against every storm. The house and the land had become inseparable, bound by history and by loss. Even in its grandeur, Biltmore bore the quiet marks of struggle. The intricate ceilings that drew every eye were the same ceilings that had once bankrupted accounts. The gardens that bloomed so vividly had been born of endless labor, sacrifice. The estate's beauty was inseparable from its burden. Visitors often marveled at the elegance of the dining hall or the view from the terraces, yet few understood the countless decisions, the painful compromises, and the hidden depths that had allowed such beauty to exist. Every detail was a testament not only to creation but to endurance. As generations of Vanderbilts passed, Each left their own imprint on the estate's legacy. The house that once symbolized personal glory evolved into something far greater, a shared inheritance, a responsibility that transcended wealth. The family's role shifted from that of owners to that of caretakers, their duty no longer to live in grandeur, but to ensure that the story of Biltmore would never fade. What began as a monument to one man's vision had become a living dialogue between past and present, between dream and consequence. Through the decades, the estate weathered the changing currents of time, world wars, recessions, shifting values. It adapted to survive, expanding into new ventures while preserving its historic soul. The vineyards that now spread across the hills, the inn that welcomed travelers, the carefully restored rooms, all were part of that evolution. Biltmore had become a paradox, both a thriving enterprise and a relic, both alive and haunted. It existed in two worlds, the practical and the poetic, where every act of preservation was also an act of remembrance. To walk through Biltmore was to walk through layers of history, each step echoing with the footsteps of those who came before. The marble floors still remembered the weight of George's stride, the faint laughter of Cornelia, the resolute footsteps of Edith pacing through the halls at dusk. Outside, the wind that brushed through the oaks seemed to carry their voices, blending with the rustle of leaves and the low hum of distant life. The estate, for all its grandeur, had become a vessel of memory, one that held not just the story of a family, but of a nation learning what it meant to dream, to build, and to bear the cost of its own ambition. And through it all, Biltmore remained what it had always been, both light and shadow, beauty and burden, triumph and warning. It stood unbroken against the horizon, timeless yet scarred, whispering to all who came that dreams, no matter how magnificent, are never free.